and welcome to today's episode of One Question Leads to Another. Today's question is this: do I think we should apologise for the past crimes of our country or our society? Well, my answer is very simple. No. Okay, see you next time. Okay, I'm kidding. I think I should give you a reason, or maybe several reasons. Okay, let's start with something that I read again recently, and it's been going on all my life. I've been hearing demands all my life that Britain should apologise for its part in the slave trade. Now, I'll start by saying that I believe the slave trade was probably the worst and darkest and most disgusting episode in Britain's history. Britain, like every nation, has done good and it's done bad, but this was really utterly appalling. There's absolutely no doubt about that. Having said that, we need to put this into some sort of historical perspective. Every colonial power in Europe was involved in the slave trade, starting with Portugal and Spain, then France, the Netherlands, etc. And Britain was basically the last one in, or one of the last ones in. And not only was it a latecomer, it got more attention because Britain was actually very good at running this type of business, or those people who did it. It was not Britain's government, it was obviously private companies. So they were pretty good at it. But one thing we have to say is that Britain was the first country out, the first country to abolish the slave trade in 1807. This is not to diminish Britain's guilt, but just to put things into perspective. Slavery was abolished altogether in 1833. The only country that abolished slavery before Britain was actually Haiti. And Haiti abolished it after they rebelled against their colonial masters, Napoleon's French government. It's interesting that the motto of the French government was liberté, égalité et fraternité, but not for their slaves and not for Africans. Okay, so Britain abolished the slave trade in 1806, and at the Congress of Vienna, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the British government, which had financed most of the Allies in order to defeat Napoleon, put a lot of pressure on other governments to abolish the slave trade with mixed success. In fact, the Royal Navy made great efforts to break the transatlantic slave trade. There are those who claim that these efforts were cosmetic. They were not. Check the facts. Now, I remember watching a really awful TV series made in the 70s, I think, based on a book called Roots, and it was about the African slave trade. I won't go into the details. Check it out if you want to. I'm sure you'll find it. And it also seemed to imply, and actually showed, Europeans going into the jungle and enslaving people in the jungle in Central Africa. Utter nonsense, because at that time Europeans had such difficulty resisting African diseases that most Europeans who were sent to Africa, I think the death rate was around 50%. And so it was the West African nations who actually sold the slaves, who did the enslaving and sold the slaves to the Europeans, and had been buying and selling slaves amongst themselves for many, many centuries. Countries like Benin, Dahomey, the Ashanti Empire, and so on. I'm glad that this has been recognised nowadays. And of course, when tropical medicine came in, obviously Europe was able to colonise Africa, but of course it didn't do it before the middle of the 1800s because it was too dangerous. One more point on this, one more point on this is that before any European nations traded in African slaves, the Arab world had already started, centuries before. And there are claims that it continued right up into the 20th century. I don't hear many people telling the Arab world to apologise for slavery. Maybe they do, but we don't hear about it. Whatever the facts and whatever you believe, we need to ask ourselves this question. Is it morally right, is it morally acceptable to judge people for the crimes of their ancestors? Why should I feel the slightest guilt for any crimes committed before I was born? I was not involved at all. Imposing collective guilt on other populations is something that has happened many times in history. The most well-known case is the imposition by Christianity and later by the Nazis of historical guilt on the Jews. And we all know where that led. There have been many cases of collective guilt being imposed on populations in the past. It often leads to persecution and in many cases genocide. Many communist countries are equally guilty of this, although that gets far less publicity. Okay, even if you could accept that the nation could, rather than an individual member, should apologise for some past event, by default, that guilt will be also placed on the shoulders of the population. And even if you could stomach the idea of collective guilt, does it really exist? Let's take an episode in Tony Blair's premiership. Tony Blair, enough said. He once apologised to Ireland for the Irish potato famine. Now, I don't think even the most anti-British person would be stupid enough to claim that this was a deliberate act of genocide. There's absolutely zero evidence for that. It was a combination of selfishness, callousness, incompetence, racism, and a host of other defects. But there was no plan to kill so many people. There was no plan to wipe out a population. I felt quite offended by Blair's fatuous apology, not only because of the immorality, in my opinion, of placing collective guilt on people for the behaviour of their ancestors, but also because my ancestors were either agricultural labourers or factory workers, as far as I know. They did not have the vote. They were not able to influence their government in any way at all. Now, I've never received an apology for crimes against my ancestors, and I'm very grateful for that. But let's imagine that I had. What crime could it be? Well, the only one I can think of is that I was born in Coventry. And in November of 1940, and particularly on the night of the 15th of November, the German Air Force devastated the city centre, killing loads of civilians, over 1,000 I think on the first night, I can't remember, and of course maiming and injuring many, many more, and making tens of thousands homeless. Now, I know that Germany was bombed a lot worse after that, but I'm just making this kind of imaginary point at this point. Imagine if the German Chancellor or the President was daft enough to apologise today to the people of Coventry. How would I feel? Well, I'd feel sorry for the German people because they've been insulted by their own government. But I'd also feel patronised that I'm stupid enough to take such an apology seriously. Okay, there's another thing I think. I'm very cautious about judging people in the past centuries by the standards of the present world. Why? Well, just imagine how people in 100 or 200 years' time in the future might judge us. They might say that, oh, back then, people were disgusting. They ate meat. They kept pets, animals enslaved in houses for the owner's entertainment. Now, look, before anybody starts writing all sorts of nasty comments, I'm not judging these actions in any way. I'm just giving examples of what people could think of in the future. It could be anything. Imagine people in 200 years will look back at our society and say, oh my God, people ate Nutella. Okay, I would escape that judgment. I don't like Nutella, and living in Italy, that makes me really unusual, a bit of a maverick. Anyway, I said what I wanted to say. Have a great week. Bye for now.